Okay, can everybody hear me? Everybody in the back? All right, good. So welcome. You've already been in DevOps for a while. Today we're going to talk about Spring, especially Spring Framework 4.0, the next generation, what you can expect in the next version, and talk a little bit about kind of the migration from 3 to 4.0. So my name is Sam Brannen. I'm a Spring developer and Java developer consultant at SwiftMind, which is a company I founded a few years ago with some colleagues in Zurich, Switzerland. I've been developing Java for over 15 years, which is quite some time, and Spring for also, 8 years, something like that. I've been a core Spring committer since 2007. Most people probably know me from the Spring Test Context Framework or the annotation-driven testing support with Spring, so for JUnit 4 and TestNG. And I'm also a Spring trainer, as well as a speaker at conferences on things like Spring, Java, sometimes OSGI, and testing as well. So quickly about my company, as I mentioned, we're in Zurich, experts in Java, enterprise Java in particular, Spring Star, so not just a core framework, but other portfolio projects like Spring Batch integration, etc. Also Java EE in general, OSGI, and Agile methodology, so Scrum and things like that. Basically, software engineering best practices and consulting. If you want to find us, you can find us in Zurich on site, or at SwiftMind on Twitter, and of course on our website, swiftmind.com. So next up, show of hands. Hopefully I can see you around. I guess everyone here is probably a Java developer, so I won't ask that. Who's not a Java developer? How about that? No hands? Okay. Who uses Spring currently? Wow. Who doesn't use Spring? Okay, well, maybe you get something out of this. Who's and don't be shy, who's still using Spring 2.5? Okay. 3.0? Okay. 3.1? 3.2? 3.2.5? Cutting edge? 4.0? Anyone? Milestones, release candidates? A few people. Has anybody actually checked out 4.0, as in like looked at what you can do with it already? One person. I don't believe that. No one's read any of the blogs. Okay, well, then hopefully you'll learn a lot today. So the agenda, it's basically a whirlwind tour of the new features in 4.0, but starting off with a brief review and the 3.x timeline, everything that we covered there, the new changes and programming models. They'll talk about the main themes in 4.0, moving on to Spring support with Java EE, enterprise APIs, etc. Then talk about Java SE, moving into nice segue into Java 8 features when running on Spring 4.0 and what you can hope to benefit from there. So, since most people are on 3.x, might not be news, but it's good to have kind of a refresher to see what some of the major features were and also how it ties into some of the newer features in 4.0. So 3.x, really new component model focusing on annotation based, so Java config, annotation-driven configuration with custom stereotypes. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that, but we'll look at some examples with that. Configuration classes, so at configuration, at bean, Java config. Composable annotations, where you can combine your own. And profiles, so bean definition profiles. Who actually uses bean definition profiles? Several people. Okay, good. So spell, hopefully you know what that stands for. It's the Spring expression language. It was introduced 3x timeline. One of the main features, basically allowing you to have little one-liners, expressions in your XML config, but also in things like at values, so for having dynamic values, maybe pulled from system properties, etc. Also add cacheable in other parts of the framework like Spring Security. Also in JSPs, so you can actually interact with Spring Beans. In terms of web support and 3.x timeline, what we saw there, first and foremost, comprehensive REST support, so for RESTful web services as opposed to SOAP web services, which is already available in the Spring Web Services project. And then building on that, additional new features in the at MVC model, so annotation-driven MVC with Spring. Of course, another major feature there was support for asynchronous processing in your web tier, and basically building off Spring 3.0 tying into, Servlet 3.0 tying into some of the asynchronous callbacks there, but being able to use that within your Spring MVC controllers. Next up, Declarative. Several different types of declarative services you can use in the Spring 3.x timeline. First up, validation and formatting. So if you're using JSR-303, Bean validation, things like at, not null, etc. Things you might know from Hibernate Validator. You can use that on your Spring components, on your Spring beans, and also for your model entities that back your controller forms. Scheduling we also introduced. So with things like at scheduled, we'll look at a new feature in 4.0 with that later. But basically tying it, or a replacement for things like quartz, allowing you to have triggers with Spring and also cron expressions. You can do it with XML or annotation driven. And caching, one of the more recent features. So with annotation driven caching support and a caching abstraction with different tie-ins. So in memory for testing or smaller apps, and support for JCache and some other third-party frameworks. Next up, testing. In the 3x timeline, we actually saw several new features brought in there. First up, I mentioned here the JDBC namespace, also the embedded database. You might have used that in Java config, not particular to testing, but very nice in testing situations. So integration testing when you want to start up a database in memory, populate it, and then run your repositories against that, so Hibernate, JPA, etc. Beyond that, so we added support for Java config in core configuration, and then we later added support for testing that, so you can test, have integration tests with XML or with Java classes if you like. Web app configuration, one of the more recent things in 3.2. Has anyone used the web app configuration support? A few people? Okay, so I can highly recommend that if you're using Spring MVC or Spring REST. Very useful for loading a web application context in your tests. And tying into that, most recently in 3.2.2, so it came out in a minor release, was support for testing with context hierarchies, also in coordination with web application contexts. Then beyond that, something that Ross and Stoyanov introduced in 3.2 was the Spring MVC test framework. Who's heard of that? A few people? Okay. So it's actually a really cool Fluent API way for testing your Spring MVC controllers and REST controllers, RESTful endpoints, more like a unit testing scenario, so out of the container, not running in Jetty or Tomcat. So I really recommend that if you're writing Spring MVC applications. Some of the key specifications, just to kind of compare with what we have now and what you can expect with 4.0. So in 3x, as mentioned before, JSR-330, so common annotations for dependency injection in Java, also used in CDI and Juice, but supported fully in Spring. So if you don't want to use Springs at autowired, you can use standards like at inject, at named instead of at qualifier, and the provider mechanism. JSR-303, mentioned that before, bean validation, declarative constraints, and an embedded validation engine in your Spring application context. Next up, JPA2 support. So basically allowing you to have persistence provider integration in your Spring application, and naturally to have, for example, use of Springs at transactional for declarative transaction management, but with your JPA provider. And Servlet 3.0, I mentioned before, async request processing, but also in the 3x timeline, you have the ability to move completely away from XML, not only in your Spring configuration, but also in your web configuration. So moving away from WebXML, moving to annotation-driven configuration, Java configuration in your Servlet container. It's a quick overview here. So what does a typical annotated component look like? Kind of best practice these days in Spring. So we have a Pojo class here, implementing our interface, book admin service, and annotated with a stereotype at service at the top. Then for dependency injection using standard annotations, for example here, at inject, injecting our account repository, and then with our methods in the service here, we can annotate them, for example, with at transactional, at cacheable, etc. Now, composable stereotypes, I mentioned that before. The previous slide, at service is a stereotype. It's a stereotype for at component. And in Spring 3x, so you can combine meta-annotations and create your own custom stereotypes for your application. And maybe you're not familiar with it, but meta-annotation means basically you have an annotation on the declaration of another annotation. So Java doesn't support inheritance for annotations, and this is kind of a workaround that a lot of people use to kind of introduce pseudo-inheritance with annotations. And these things are automatically picked up by default. We'll see an example here. So here we have an interface we're defining, public at interface, my service for our application, and we're annotating this with a couple of different Spring annotations. So we have at service at the top, specifying request scoped to be request scoped bean, and transactional, all methods should be transactional, and rollback for exception. So basically, if we have this kind of configuration, want to reuse it in our application, we can define it once on an annotation, and then use that custom stereotype across our code base. And we'll see in 4.0 how that's even been enhanced even further. For configuration classes, again, don't have to use XML anymore if you don't want to. A lot of people are choosing to use Java config, a lot more powerful, a lot more natural. We'll see that later on more support for Groovy in this direction as well. And here we have what we call a configuration class, annotated with that configuration, with a profile saying that this bean will only be instantiated and used in our context in the production environment. And then we define beans with methods and reference other beans within our application context just via standard method invocations in Java here. So you have this book admin data source invoking the book admin data source method, and that's actually another bean, and Spring handles the magic behind the scenes for you to make that happen. So next up, we'll jump into the new 4.0 themes and see where we're actually heading. First up, we have some new baselines, so some new minimum requirements that you would expect with any major upgrade. So for starters, Java SE 6, so JDK 6 and above is now required. And in Java EE, that's going to be Java EE 6 and above, focusing on Servlet 3.0, but also still providing backwards compatibility with Servlet 2.5. One very important thing to point out here is that all deprecated packages have been removed. So if you're seeing any warnings in your code base right now, stop ignoring them, right? If you're on 3.2 and you see a bunch of warnings, you should take the time now to see what those deprecations point you to, what you should be migrating to, make the migration now, because when you drop in 4.0, it won't be like in the past where there's a guaranteed backwards compatibility. Some things just won't compile, and some things just won't work because some classes won't be there, and some fields and methods have also been removed. So, like I said, if you see the warnings now, take action now, and you'll be ready for 4.0. In terms of third-party libraries, what we decided to do there was basically to say, hey, if something's really old, so from before mid-2010, we're not going to support that anymore, and we basically bumped up all the minimum versions for open source libraries to something that was released around mid-2010. So for example, we have some here, Hibernate, minimum 3.6, Quartz 1.8, and a minimum of JCache for 2.1 and above. And for other dependencies, just check out the palms. Now, Java 8 language and API features. I assume everyone's seen quite a bit so far at the conference. Some stuff with Lambdas, maybe method references and things like that. And we'll talk more in detail about Lambda expressions using those within Spring, how it's a natural fit. We'll also talk about method references and the JSR-310 Date-Time API, which is also a nice addition in Java 8 JDK. We'll also take a quick look at repeatable annotations and parameter name discovery, which is probably one of the less well-known features in Java 8, but can be useful in a framework like Spring. So I hinted at it before, Groovy and Spring, so Spring 4.0. Basically, there's a new facelift there. Our main goal here was to provide a smooth, out-of-the-box experience for anybody who's writing Groovy-based Spring applications. What that means in particular, things like AOP, so that you have that working seamlessly. We now have special handling of Groovy object calls for Spring AOP and Groovy. And you can now, for the first time, consider writing your entire application in Groovy as well as your config. So not even using Java config or XML, but using Groovy and having it all work nice in a Spring application context. So we'll see an example in a second. Groovy-based bean definition. So historically we had XML, right? And then we moved to annotation driven with things like @component, component scanning, etc. And then full-blown Java config. Now we see with Spring 4.0 that we have full-blown Groovy support for building your application context. And this comes from basically the bean builder. Some of you might be familiar with that from the Grails project. That's now a core part of Spring. It's the new Spring-beans-groovy module. And you can use that to configure your application context. So as an example, we'll see here, there's a Groovy DSL. And you can import things like standard importing something from your domain, and then defining your beans. This is analogous to what you would see in XML, but with the Groovy DSL. And you can also import namespaces from XML, just like the custom XML schema support in Spring XML configuration. You can import util, and then each of your beans just defined as top-level elements here. Person 1, type person, setting the properties, inlining, so properties here, Java util properties, arrays, lists, etc. And using the namespace, so util.list, this is what you would have seen before in XML with util::list, and then creating a list on the fly there. So again, you can go completely groovy if you want. Conditional bean definitions is something new in 4.0. So as I mentioned before, we had support for bean definition profiles, right? With that profile and in testing with active profiles, where you could basically specify a logical group of beans. So you could say these are production beans or these are development beans, but you were limited to the hard-coded value, right? So it was just a string, and we found there's a need to have a more programmatic approach there. And to that end, we have a new generalized model for what we call conditional bean definitions, more flexible than what we had before. And you can use this for smart defaulting, doing things programmatically. And you can, for example, see Spring Boot, they really make use of that. They basically analyze your code automatically as they're starting up the application. They look and see, are there beans of this type? Maybe there's a session factory. Okay, then hybrid needs to be used, right? So it can do things like that, or it can see, okay, a data source is needed. Maybe we can create automatically an in-memory database. So you can really do a lot of magic there. Who's actually heard of Spring Boot? Yeah. Okay, good. So if you haven't heard about that, I encourage you to check it out. It's really a way to bootstrap your Spring application with zero or minimum amount of configuration on your end, and it just automatically figures out what's in the class path, what kind of annotations you're using, etc. So to that end, we have this new @conditional annotation, and then with a strategy interface here, so it's condition, you can implement that. You can react to rich context. Like I was saying, you can check out maybe what kind of classes are available in the class path, what kind of jars are there. You can also see, are there bean definitions already defined? Should I then maybe create my beans based on those? And yeah, for the profile support that we had before, that's actually now been converted to a profile condition. So we're eating our own dog food there. Custom annotations. I mentioned before we had the support in the 3x timeline, but now in 4.0 we have support for overrides. This is a bit more magic, because I mentioned before there's no actual support for inheritance with annotations in Java, but we have some code that approximates that. So basically you can now have your own custom stereotypes, and they can override specific attributes of their meta annotations or of their parent annotations, if you want to think about it like inheritance. There's obviously no compile time checks for that. No static type checks for that. It's all just based on convention. So the convention is, if it's called the same thing and it's of the same type, then it would override an attribute in the meta annotation. As an example, we have here, if you think about @transactional, it has this read-only flag that's a Boolean. So if you defined your own custom stereotype and called it myTransactional, and you defined a Boolean attribute read-only, then when you use myTransactional within your code base, you can override the whatever read-only flag was set in your custom stereotype, or whatever the default was from Spring for that. Similarly, we see here with session scope, if you had a custom mySessionScope stereotype that you'd created, you could override, for example, the scoped proxy mode attribute here. And you could actually override attributes from multiple annotations. It's a bit tricky there. As I mentioned before, there is no actual inheritance there, but we just have a map that's basically replacing the values and taking them from the lowest level in your annotation hierarchy. Next up, lazy resolution proxies. Who's ever written a lazy bean in Spring? Who's ever heard of lazy initialization? A few more, okay, more people. All right. So basically in the past, well, even to now, to date as well, if you wanted to have a bean that was not eagerly initiated, so not an eager singleton in your application context, you could have used lazynet equals true, for example, in XML, or the @lazy annotation on your actual component, or on your @bean method if you're using Java config. And what that says is, I have this bean definition, I've defined the metadata for it, configured it, but I don't want Spring to instantiate this bean unless some other bean references it, right? Or unless someone explicitly looks up this bean from the application context. But when we use it like that, that's on the source, right? So the bean definition is the source for this metadata. And now what we're talking about in 4.0 is that you can use @lazy on the injection point, so on the target, the other end. So the one end you have the provider of the definition for the bean, and then the other end you have a consumer, someone that actually uses the bean. So now with 4.0 you can use @lazy, for example, where you're injecting with @autowired or @inject. and you can say this bean should be lazily injected, and that's done via a proxy. So you got a proxy to it, and then as soon as you actually use it, Spring will then instantiate the bean from the application context. So if you're familiar with JSR-330 and the provider mechanism there, this is basically an alternative to doing that. So instead of injecting a provider in there and then calling get on the provider, you can now just have this bean injected in. It looks just like your bean based on the interface, but you get a proxy to that bean, and that's resolved dynamically for you at runtime. Ordered injection of lists and arrays. So one feature that's maybe not that well known since Spring 2.5 something, if you have, for example, @autowired or @inject for a list of a certain type, maybe you have some kind of observer pattern you've implemented and you have several beans of the same type in your application context, you can inject a list into your serves, for example, and then iterate over all of those beans. But in the past, you couldn't really control the order. It was kind of indeterministic the way they're injected. But now, on the candidate beans themselves, if they implement either the ordered interface from Spring, or if they're annotated with that order, you can be very explicit about the order in which they should be sorted before this list is injected into your component, so into your service. And yeah, the order is relative within the specific injection result set there. So dependency injection and generics. One thing that improves with every release is Spring support for generics. So back in 2.5, started doing a lot of work, and then with each release, we find some more things that didn't work, or people say, I have this use case, and now we see in 4.0, improved it even more. So one of the things that personally annoyed me, even way back to 2.5, is that if you're doing something like the generic repository pattern, where you have your interface that's parameterized by a particular type, so for example, repository of type user, repository of type customer, etc., maybe you didn't have an interface that you physically wrote called user repository, right? You wanted to just inject something of type repository parameterized by user. That didn't work in the past, but now with 4.0, that will work. So we get type matching based on the full generic type that's available there. So you can actually have things like this, my repository customer, and you don't have to define explicitly a customer repository interface just to get around this dependency injection issue. Another thing that we improved in 3.2, didn't get completely right, is support for static factory methods, for example, that are also parameterized. And now that works as you would expect in 4.0. So for example, if you have things like Mockito and EasyMock, where you're creating a mock in your application context, replacing the production bean, that will now work based on the type and create your dynamic mock for you. Of course, you can use this in other use cases. It's just that Mockito and EasyMock are very often used for these static factory methods. Spring messaging, who's heard of that? 3 or 4, 5 maybe? Okay, so that's another new module in core Spring. It resides in the org Spring Framework messaging package. And basically what it is we've extracted a lot of the core features from Spring Integration. So Spring Integration is a sister project, right? Based on Spring and focusing on enterprise integration patterns. So things like channels, messaging, filtering, all these kinds of things. And we'll see in a minute. So talking about things like WebSockets and having new messaging models, asynchronous messaging models running in a Spring application. In core, we brought in a lot of these features. So things like the message concept, channel concept, adapters, things like that. We've brought that into core Spring. Which brings us into WebSockets. Who's heard of WebSockets? I guess everyone's heard of WebSockets now. All right, who's actually used WebSockets? A few people? Yeah, so I saw there was a tweet, someone was hoping to see a lot about WebSockets in here because they went to the previous talk. Unfortunately, I'm only going to talk very briefly about that. But if you're interested in more about WebSockets with Spring, Rasen Stoyanchev is the main developer for that, and he's written a couple of different blogs. He also did a webinar. You can check that out on YouTube. So if you're interested and you can't find the link, just ask me later, but there's a lot of information about that. So yeah, he talked about it for an hour and a half. I'm going to talk about it for about a minute. So WebSockets, right, so basically we have a new endpoint model in core Spring that's analogous to what we already have in place for Spring MVC and Spring MVC REST. So basically the annotation-driven programming model with components and controllers. Sorry. In Core Spring, however, we do support the standard JSR-356, but we go beyond that. So JSR-356 really focuses on WebSocket, and that's a really low-level API, right? So you're looking more like at sockets, and developers don't usually work with sockets too often. We prefer to have things like controllers or endpoints that we can work with. So to that end, what Spring provides here that's a real benefit to developers is support with SockJS, so on your client, to have different fallback options in case your server doesn't have support for WebSockets, or in case you have issues with WebSocket protocol being open across your proxies and things like that. So you have fallback mechanisms. You can use WebSockets if they're there. Otherwise, you have fallback to polling, for example, and then also STOMP, so as a text-based protocol, so simple text, or as the messaging protocol. We have support for that in Spring, and we'll see an example in a minute of what that could look like in your code. And building off of this new Spring messaging module, we have basically these generic messaging patterns. Thinking about channels, messages come in, you have automatic marshalling and unmarshalling. Your endpoint method gets invoked, just like in Spring MVC, and then depending on how you annotate your method, the response might get then routed back to a different channel, potentially also going through a full-blown broker. So here, STOMP over WebSocket in Spring, the programming model. We have here simple POJO class, my STOMP controller, and it's annotated with @controller. That's the exact same annotation you would use in Spring MVC. And then you can use dependency injection just like you would expect with Spring. Now in terms of the methods, these handler methods, here we have one example, get portfolios, taking the principal. The principal would be the current user. So one thing I'd like to point out here is if you're using Spring Security already in your Spring MVC application and you want to start using WebSocket, you can continue to do that, and Spring Security will come in because with WebSocket, the initial communication is going to be over HTTP, and then there's going to be an upgrade to the WebSocket protocol. But with that initial invocation, or the initial request, Spring Security comes into play with its standard filters. You can have authentication, authorization, and then have access to the principal, the current user. So here we see annotated with @subscribe-event, something new. Not quite like request mapping, but more related to messaging. So you think about event-driven asynchronous processing with a STOMP message coming in, and you can use paths here just like you would with HTTP paths, so request paths. And then you can provide other objects as parameters that will be also converted. You could have the payload brought in as well. You do something and you return a list, and then that gets sent back to the correct client. Another example we have here is @message mapping to /trade and executing a trade. So this is basically sending it into this channel here, executing that, taking in the trade. Could have been as the body, perhaps JSON there, converted automatically to your trade entity, and then also giving you access to the current user, for example, again with Spring Security. Doing something with that, not returning anything, so then that just gets sent to the message and nothing gets sent back. Another thing I can put out here, within the same class, so this @controller class, you could also have Spring MVC handler methods, so @request mappings, or you could have Spring REST methods in the same class, so you could have like request body as well. So again, this is just a quick overview of what you can do. There's a lot of information about this. Again, check out the webinar from Ross and Soyanchev, about an hour and a half, a lot more detailed information showing you how you can tie this into a real broker, for example, RabbitMQ, etc. The asynchronous REST template. Who's actually used Spring's REST template? A few people? Okay. So the REST template, it came with the initial Spring MVC REST support, but the standard Spring MVC REST support is for the server side, and the REST template is for client side, so you can write your own client to invoke a remote REST service and get the response back with automatic marshalling and unmarshalling with JSON, XML, etc. But the thing is that those are blocking calls. So now with 4.0, we've introduced a new async REST template, analogous to the existing REST template, but basically just with futures there and concurrent invocation support there. So here we have a new listenable feature inspired by a listenable feature from Google Code, and basically that provides you a way to hook in to the response. So when the response comes back, you can have your code invoked, and then you can actually do something with that response asynchronously. In terms of testing, we do have a few smaller changes. First up, things that are gone. So if you're using JUnit 3.8 support, anyone still using JUnit 3.8? One guy? Okay, so hopefully you won't be too bad. Yeah, it was deprecated, so we deleted all support for that, the standalone class hierarchy, as well as the support and test conducts framework. Also, if you're using some of the things from Spring back in the 2.0, 2.5 timeline, things like at expected exception, at not transactional, those things have been deleted since they were deprecated. And another one, simple JDBC test utils that might actually be in use by some people when writing repository tests, Hibernate tests, etc. So that's gone now. It's been replaced by JDBC test utils in the same package. What we've updated some of the Servlet API mocks, just some enhancements there, making things work more like you'd expect them to. And in terms of new testing features, we've introduced socket utils. That's actually a core utility. I just mention it here because it's often the case when you're writing integration tests, you want to start up something, for example, an embedded SMTP server or an embedded FTP server for your integration tests, and you want to find out what kind of port's free, and you can use this socket utils to scan for available UDP and TCP ports. But of course, not just in testing, you could use this anywhere in your application where you need to have a free port or a range of free ports. In terms of active profiles, so again, going back to bean definition profiles, in the past we had support in tests with the @active profiles annotation, and now active profiles resolver is a programmatic way to determine which profiles you want active for the current integration test, and that's configurable via @context configuration in your integration tests. There's a new resolver attribute there. Next up, newer feature. So in testing, it hasn't been the case up until now that you could use your own or create your own kind of custom stereotypes and tests. We saw that you could do that already in your application configuration, and then now with 4.0 you can even override attributes. And now with 4.0 we have full-blown support for writing your own custom meta-annotations for tests. So basically just reducing boilerplate and abiding by the dry principle, right? So do not repeat yourself. As an example, we see here, let's assume that in 20, 30, 50, 200 integration tests across our test suite, we found that we had need for the same configuration. So for example, setting up via @context configuration app config, and then overriding that with test config, either with XML or with configuration classes with Java config, and then setting the active profile to dev to make sure we're using an in-memory database for dev and not talking to production, for example. And then, for example, here also as well, @transactional. What we can do now is we can define those all together, use them as meta-annotations on one annotation, and then we can reuse this @transactional test annotation on our integration tests. One thing to point out here is that with JUnit, the JUnit support for @runwith is not handled as a meta-annotation, or JUnit will not find it unless it's explicitly there. So it's not possible to put @runwith on top of your custom Spring annotation. Next up, we'll talk about Spring in Java EE and then SE. So first up, kind of an overview where we came from, where we're going to. Spring 2.5, we completed the support for Java EE 5, basically providing 3 versions, support always at the same time, so 1.3, 4, and 5. Then when we moved to 3.0, we bumped that up a bit to 1.4 is the minimum, but supporting up to Java EE 6. And then in 3.1, 3.2, where most of you appear to be at the moment, basically 1.4 support deprecated through EE 6, but with a stronger focus on 3.0 Servlet specification, so asynchronous callbacks, Java-based configuration, etc. And now in 4.0, what we see is explicit support for Java EE 7, so the latest and greatest, but with backwards compatibility to Java EE 5, for example, if you're using the JPA 2.0 feature pack, and then Java EE 6 and EE 7. In terms of updates, what you'd expect, we're just trying to keep up with the latest and greatest. Some of you might have seen the talks on JMS support, so JMS 2.0, big, huge jump from 1.1. Lots of new features, a lot more modern, things like delivery delay, you can use that with Spring. Some of the create session variants, JMS context, some of these things, you can now use them with Spring. And of course, you can continue to use Spring's JMS template with support for JMS 1.1 as you had in the past. JTA, it's been bumped up to 1.2, so the new @transactional annotation, some of you might have seen that. It's strikingly similar to the @transactional annotation from Spring, but if you want to switch to a standard annotation, you can now use that from JTA 1.2 and use that within your service layer, for example, and Spring already supports that. JPA, we bumped up to 2.1, so for example, support for unsynchronized persistence context. And bean validation, we've also just bumped that up to 1.1. What you get from that would now be method parameter and return value constraints. In terms of SE, so JDK, version supported. 2.5 was 1.436. In 3.0, we raised the bar to Java 5 and above, so bringing in support for generics, annotations, etc., obviously with annotation-driven configuration. Basically Java 5 through Java 6. And then 3.1 and 3.2, we bumped up to JDK 7. Not too many major language features there that really helped you with Spring, but in the 4.0 timeline, now moving into Java 8, you'll see explicit support for language features in Java 8 in Spring and how that can simplify your own coding. So without further ado, we'll take a look at the Java 8 programming model and then how it works in with Spring. So state of Java 8, some of you might have noticed, somewhat delayed, but we've been building against it for the entire 4.0 timeline, so we've just been using the early access releases for JDK 8. Yeah, scheduled for September 2013 GA, but we see now just a developer preview that's been available, and now, yep, final sometime next year. However, Spring 4 will still be coming out next month, so building off the developer preview and the early access releases, and we just have to hope that not too much changes between now and the final version. In terms of IDE support, you might be wondering, can I actually develop with Spring on Java 8, or do I have to just, in the IDE, or do I have to just use the standard text editor, maybe VI, Emacs, etc.? There is some support, maybe not as much as you would hope for. IntelliJ fans out there probably already noticed there has been support already for almost a year now, since IDEA 12. Eclipse, not such a good story. Full support announced for June next year, so maybe better hold off on upgrading. However, there are some early access beta versions for support with JDK 8, also in STS, so Spring Tool Suite, if you're using that, the Spring branded and enhanced version of Eclipse. They have a download site, update site, where they have nightly builds with new Eclipse-based beta support, so you can check it out a bit earlier. What we've been doing is we don't actually code so much to the language features, but rather the APIs, so things like the new Java Date-Time APIs, we can use those fine using current versions of Eclipse, pointing to the JDK 8 as a compiler, just not using language features. It's if you want to use new language features like Lambdas and stuff like that, then you're going to have to get some beta work or switch to IntelliJ or go to VI in the command line. So have fun. Java 8 bytecode level, probably very straightforward. Dash target 1.8. Set your bytecode up to compile to Java 8, compiler's default. But what does that mean to you as a programmer or when using Spring? There are some things to keep in mind. One thing, for example, is that it's not accepted by ASM 4.x, and ASM is what Spring uses internally for parsing your bytecode, for example, with component scanning and other internal features. So obviously it just wouldn't work. Other things that come up are things like aspect J, right, where you have some kind of bytecode manipulation or bytecode extensions, right? So the newest versions of your open source third-party libraries have to also understand Java 8 bytecode. So the way we get around this is in Spring Framework 4.0, we have a patched version of ASM 4.1 with support for Java 8 bytecode, and we've jar-jarred this. So who knows what jar-jar is? Okay, and put your hand down if you think I'm talking about Star Wars. So I'm not talking about the Star Wars guy. But really only like 10 people know what jar-jar is. Yeah? Okay. So jar-jar is an open source project on Google Code. What it allows you to do is take a jar, and you say, whatever's in that jar, morph all the package names into my package, and then recreate the jar. So it's jarring a jar with modifications in between. And that's what we do in Spring for CGlib and ASM. So basically we keep the jar hell away from you, and we say we depend on this patched version. We don't want you to depend on it, and we jar that included in Spring Core. Some of the changes you'll see as a developer in Java 8, HashMap, HashSet, a few differences there, different algorithms used when calculating the hashes. Now, of course, you shouldn't be depending on this, but some people do, and if you do, you'll find that your elements get returned in different order. So just one thing to keep in mind. Don't do it, but if you are doing it, make sure you have tests in place when upgrading to Java 8. Now, in terms of Java 8 Lambda conventions, hopefully we've all heard by now what they are, but basically the simple rule is you have an interface with a single method. Typically these are going to be callback interfaces. For example, see in Spring, lots of the callback interfaces have a single method, just a single purpose. You would have implemented them in the past as an anonymous inner class, and now you can implement them in line with Lambdas. For example, from the JDK, things like runnable and callable, and these are formerly called single abstract methods. So SAM types has nothing to do with me, it's just a coincidence. The reason I mentioned that is if you're looking up stuff on Google, you might want to search for single abstract method types, but now they're officially called functional interfaces, and there's a new @functional interface annotation in Java 8 that you can use to instruct the compiler that your interface must abide by the conventions and have a single abstract method. Now, in terms of taking Lambda plus Spring, we are very happy, and I think you will be too. It ends up just being a very natural fit in most cases. And the reason for that is that a lot of the Spring APIs that have been around for years and years are just automatically candidates to be used as Lambdas. So there's a few examples here. JmsTemplate with some of the callbacks there. One of the callbacks that's commonly used is message creator, which defines a simple method, create message, taking in the current JMS session and returning a message. So you create the message internally, and you can now use that in a Lambda. Also with transaction template, if you have some kind of advanced needs for programmatic transaction management and not just declarative, then you could use Spring's transaction template, providing a data source and then implementing a transaction callback, and then have your callback invoked at the right time with the current transaction status and returning an object or potentially a void. Next up, JdbcTemplate, one of the more commonly used, I think. Who's actually used JdbcTemplate? Okay. Who's used row mapper? Good number of people. Good. So we're going to use that as an example to kind of see how you can use Java 8 with Spring. The row mapper, common interface here, callback, defining one method, map row, and it takes 2 arguments, so let's keep these in mind. So map row takes first the result set from JDBC, and then the current row number. Your job is to parse some information out of the current result set, create an object, and return it. So the object would typically be something from your domain, perhaps a person, a user, an order, something like that. Now we see here in this first example, Spring, Lambdas, and JdbcTemplate. We just have to somehow get hold of the JdbcTemplate here in instantiating one, and then we see on the template we can invoke the query method that takes 3 parameters. The first is the query string. The query string has a placeholder we see here. So, and then the next is a prepared statement setter that we see. It's from Spring, and this is our first Lambda here. So basically, it's just invoking set string on the prepared statement, replacing placeholder 1 with the word sales. So that's performing this replacement here. And then the next up we see this parameter declaration for our Lambda here. So again, 2 parameters. If we go back here, takes a result set and an int, and that's exactly what we see here. So result set and an int, and then it's going to return a new person and just inlining the extraction from the result set. So that's pretty straightforward. But if that's you don't find that comfortable, if that's maybe too compact for you, you can modify it slightly, change your formatting a bit, and you could here instead use brackets, return new person, etc. But that also gives you the powers to do more things, maybe for performing some kind of custom conversion, excuse me, of these values instead of just returning an object there. And next up, method references. So who's heard of method references? Yeah. Good. So where's the method reference here? Anyone see anything that wouldn't compile on Java 7? No one? So, yep, the first thing is, yep, we see this here, double colon here. That's our method reference, and that's has to reference another function within or method within this object, and here we see that is the map person. Now here, it doesn't matter what the name is, right? It doesn't have to be called map row like we saw in the row mapper interface. It just has to have the same signature. So again, we have the two parameters here, the result set as the first parameter, and then the row num as the second parameter, and then this is returning a new person. So the fact that this row mapper is actually parameterized by type T, and map person returns an object of type T, that's handled for us automatically here by Java. So we're actually working with the person instead of just an object, and we have the type safety there. So as we see here, we have a couple of different options. We can use Lambdas and inline the functionality, but if we have functionality that we want to reuse, for example, in multiple use cases within a given repository implementation or data access object implementation, then we can use method references. We can also reference methods statically from other classes, and that gives us a couple of different options here instead of having to use an anonymous inner class. And again, there are no changes to Spring here. This just works out of the box since Spring already defined these simple callbacks with single abstract methods. JSR-310, so date and time. Who uses JdbcTime? A lot of people. Okay, good. So Spring has already provided support for JdbcTime for quite some time now. The same types or with the same name, so local date time. And Spring's also provided support for, naturally, Java util, date and calendar, things like that. And also support for binding them. So if you have an object that you're using as a form backing object to back up a form for example, for a post in Spring MVC, you can have Spring automatically bind to those date types. And you can also have it parse the formats if you specify them via @datetime format. And what I want to show here is that by default, if you don't provide any @datetime format from Spring, it'll just use the ISO defaults there, coming in for parsing the date from a string and then converting it back when displaying it. So that's the data binding and type conversion and formatting. But you can also override that, providing, for example, a custom pattern here. And again, these come from the new java.time package. Looks just like JdbcTime, but it's the new standard in Java 8. So Spring already provides that support out of the box. One thing to keep in mind is that if you're using a JPA and you're trying to map the customer there, you're going to have to find a custom solution there for a custom type to map these new Java date times, since they're not supported out of the box by JPA. So just one small thing. Works great with Spring MVC, might not work so great with mapping to the database. @repeatable. Who's heard of repeated annotations? One person, really? Nobody else mentioned it at the conference. Okay. So there's a new annotation in Java 8, @repeatable. And for starters, what would compile here, what would not compile here on Java 7 and previous? How about, who thinks the top one would compile on Java 7? One guy. Who thinks the bottom would compile on Java 7? Okay, so the latter group is correct. Basically what we see here at the top is we have this @scheduled annotation from Spring. It's present twice, and that's not allowed prior to Java 8. It's a compiler error. So this is, however, allowed starting with JDK 8 via the new @repeatable annotation support, and I'll show you an example there in the code. If we look down here, what we see at the bottom is @schedules is a container. That's also kind of a new concept in Java 8, and but I want to point out you could have done this on your own since Java 5. So as soon as annotations were introduced, you were always able to create your own container. It was just never possible to leave off the container and have an annotation repeated like we see at the top. So just to give you a quick idea of what that looks like. Do I have schedules? Right, so @scheduled from Spring has existed for quite some time. And what's new, as I mentioned, is this @repeatable annotation. And there you define what the container is. So you just reference another annotation, and this annotation is just very straightforward. There's nothing special about it other than it contains that same type of annotation. So that's how you create your own container annotation. And then when you have multiple occurrences of this annotation type on your method or on your interface or class, for example, the JDK will then look, is this annotation itself meta-annotated with that repeatable? If yes, get the container type, and it will automatically stuff that into a container for you. So when you're using reflection with Java 8, you'll basically containing those other annotations. That's how that works under the hood. Yep. So, but Spring provides the support specifically with this @schedules and @scheduled, so you can have multiple, for example, multiple cron triggers to have a particular method invoked at different times during the day, whereas in the past you would have had to define another method and annotate it, and then call the original method, right? Just a bit of a hack. Parameter name discovery. Again, this is something you might not find all too useful in your own code, but very useful when using a framework like Spring. So Java 8 introduces a new parameter reflection type for methods, and this is, well, basically made possible if you compile your code with the -parameters command line argument, so similar to -debug. What Spring does, Spring has a new standard reflection parameter name discover, basically building off Java 8, and basically using the reflection there to find out the names of the parameters via the parameter type. However, as a fallback mechanism to continue with working with code compiled prior to Java 8 or without the -parameters tag, there's a default parameter name discover in Spring that will first check, okay, is the code compiled with -parameters? Can we use Java 8? If not, then it will use ASM, this jar-jarred version of ASM, to actually look at the bytecode and pull the names of variables or parameters out of the debug symbols if you compiled your code with -debug. So in case you're wondering where this is actually used in a concrete scenario, if you're using Spring MVC and you have request handler mappings and you have, for example, paths or request parameters, and you just annotate your parameters with @requestParam or @path variable, if you don't specify the name, then Spring will take the name of that parameter and parse that from the path or parse that from the request as a request parameter. However, if you don't compile your code with -parameters or with -debug, then you'll have to explicitly specify the names of your parameters, for example, with @requestParam and then ID, for example. In closing, the roadmap. So we've already come quite a long way. We already released release candidate 1 November 1st, and the next one, release candidate 2, is scheduled for the end of this month. And then coming up sometime in December, probably mid to late December, we hope to release Spring 4.0 general availability. So full featured, no more changes, running against latest versions of JDK 8. And one last note here, in terms of upgrading, what should you consider? When should you upgrade from 3.2 or stay on 4.0? First up, Spring 3.2 doesn't provide any support for JDK 8 bytecode, so that's not going to work. So if you want to, or for some reason need to, use JDK 8 language features, you're going to have to upgrade to Spring 4.0. But another thing to point out, you can upgrade to Spring 4.0 earlier because Spring 4.0 naturally supports JDK 6 and 7. And Spring Framework 3.2 is now in maintenance mode. So the last release for that just came out a few weeks ago with Spring 3.2.5. So going forward, there won't be any more releases in the 3x timeline, only 4.0 moving forward. Quick acknowledgement, Jürgen Hiller, not here today, but he let me read some of his slides, so I told him I'd thank him. Spring resources, some of you may have noticed, may not have noticed, the new Go Pivotal movement, the new website, Spring.io. If you go to springframework.org or springsource.org, you're going to get automatically redirected. So for example, Spring Framework is now at projects.spring.io/spring-framework. They really revamped the website, lots of new information there, lots of new guides. The forums have also moved, forum.spring.io, in case you have any questions or want to be interactive with the community. Another option there is, of course, Stack Overflow, very popular these days with Spring or Spring-TX, for example, other tags as well. Spring Jira, if you find bugs, there are bugs, or if you have any suggestions for improvements or new features, please open a JIRA issue and let us know what you think. And last but not least, really major improvement in the last years is really community involvement via GitHub. So if you have an account, you can check out the code, fork it, basically submit pull requests, and interact much better with the core Spring committers and help us to achieve things much faster. Blogs, my company blog, swiftmind.com/blog. We have some stuff on Spring, usually on testing features as well. And of course, the official Spring blog is now moved to spring.io/blog, and that's where you find some more information, for example, about WebSockets and some of the other newer features in Spring 4.0. So that's it. If you want to find me on Twitter, Sam_Brannen, slideshare.net, post some slides there. You can also find me on the web. And if we have any questions, I have a few minutes left. No questions? So regarding T-shirts, I've been informed that they have more T-shirts from Spring at the Pivotal booth, and we have some mugs down here from SwiftMind. If anyone wants to come by and grab a mug.